Hey everybody, this is Carlos Ocelot, founder and CEO of G2's, former professional gamer and wonderful bodybuilder, as you may have known. Of course, you know me for that, pretty sure. And you're watching Dankan's channel. Thorin, my man. Enjoy.
G2 are now the #1 ranked CSGO team in the world according to HLTV.org. Sure, it's online play that's gotten them there. Also, you know what, it's a bit awkward that they haven't really won any tournaments, but on average, it's hard to say it isn't justified. So the context to this is wild, because when they made the roster moves to put together this experimental lineup, they were quite frankly busts for the first few months. This had not worked. It looked like a failed experiment, even though it was a worthwhile gamble, bearing in mind the team they had before and kind of the dead-end cul-de-sac of where French Counter-Strike left them, especially with Vitality as the higher-ranked team in the world and with the best French player. Then they came into this year and they were already banging on LAN. They were sick straight from the beginning of Blast. Now, they had a little wobble here and there, but they are generally one of the best teams in the world. That's why it's justified they've taken this rank. They are clearly an elite team. Quite frankly, all this year long, for my money, they've been an elite squad. So consider that the previous G2 lineup, the one with Shox and with Lucky, that didn't basically ever live up to their peak of making the ESL Season 9 Pro League finals. People just ignored that event actually wasn't as big an event as some of the other big events of the year. Yes, Pro League has a massive name, and for example, the last Pro League final, Season 10, was banging. Season 9 was where Vitality and ENCE were the #2 and #3 ranked teams in the world, and they weren't there because they weren't even in Pro League. Then they went to the major and quite frankly failed it because they didn't make it to top 8. Shox leaves, one of your key pieces that you're hoping comes back into form to turn the team around. Kenny wasn't in good form anyway. Kiyashima stands in, a totally rejected player who'll probably never play at Tier 1 again. And Lucky, who basically knows he's being kicked, keeps playing despite ostensibly having been cut already. So then you come to the 30th of September, where they make this very bold, a quite expensive move as well, to get Nexa and Hunter from Crazy, who had just shown strong form at the major at times, didn't make top 8 either, but they weren't even supposed to make anything like that. I mean, they had that strong series against Astralis where they beat Astralis in that epic Dust 2 overtime game. They actually played fairly well on the Infernal game. It was terrible for that team. So when you put together this team with 2 Serbians and the 3 French players, this is a super experimental roster. It was always going to be a gamble because you had a traditionally French core that had always spoken French in their teams, and you're adding in Serbian players who now have to speak in English. Admittedly, they did in some of those other teams anyway, but it's obviously not their first language. Then you look at the team and who the people individually are. So Jax, Nexa, and Hunter all essentially had to improve their English, or at least in the sense that Nexa and Hunter understand English and are fluent in English, but now they have to understand the accents of the French players when they speak English. That's no joke in itself. Kenny S, listen, that guy's so famous and he even had a Norwegian girlfriend. So don't worry, he knows English and was absolutely fluent. He's the one who obviously I thought would be comfortable. Amanek also, I exclude from this equation as the French players because he played in Misfits from 2017 to 2018 with Sean Gares and those guys. So he's been speaking English in past teams. I assume he's more comfortable. Then you look at the type of team they wanted. Listen, this is why it wasn't a bad gamble. Because with the players, presumably, they were going to play a loose style. These players, certainly from Crazy, wanted to do that. Nexa's that kind of an in-game leader. That's in some ways going to make up for the language issues. You're not trying to do the most tactical style. But an area where I didn't know how that would fit in is you had Malek as your coach still. This is a tactical coach. This is a guy who's a veteran, who comes from the Execute era of Counter-Strike, who wants to set up a team with correct roles and play the right way. So it was a good gamble, but it was far from guaranteed across the board. I mean, even on the angle that Nexa and Hunter had looked pretty good, Hunter particularly, but who knows if that form would continue outside of an international team, outside of a Tier 2 team, quite frankly. They hadn't been true Tier 1 players in terms of having the kind of team that G2 wanted to have. So then you look, and as I said, the first period for this team, it was failure. They were busts. They looked like they actually were busts. Consider this. They went to DreamHack Masters Malmo. By the way, Vitality made the change and brought in Shox, made it all the way to the final of that event. In comes this team. They come 9th to 12th. What an underwhelming result, but whatever. First result, we can put that out of mind. Then they go to the Star Series Season 8 tournament, the one that was in, I think it was in Turkey actually. They had a decent run there, but you have to remember, 5th to 6th at that tournament isn't as sick when you remember the tournament was missing Astralis and Team Liquid, arguably two best teams in the world for many people. Certainly Team Liquid, one of the top ranked teams in the world. Astralis just won the previous major a couple of events back. So 5th to 6th is all right. It's not bad, but that was actually the peak in this period for that lineup. Then they went to the CSGO Asia Championship in China, an event that had like some good teams, had Evil Geniuses, had Mouse Spots. It didn't have Astralis, Team Liquid, didn't have a whole bunch of the other big squads, Vitality, etc. They come 7th to 8th, last place at this tournament. What an underwhelming result. Then you go to the EPL Season 10 finals. Remember, the previous lineup, the worst G2, even on paper, was in the final of ESL Pro League Season 9. Now, admittedly, Season 10 had a more stacked run. They came 9th to 12th. This is just bomby as fuck. Then, after this failure period, they have what I'm going to call the fool's gold or fake success period, because then they get a bunch of finals, boys. Problem is, one of them's CS Summit 5. Now that sounds good until you remember the only elite team at the event was Mouse Sports. I think Ents was maybe there, but Ents has already fucked their lineup. And that's not even the real Mouse Sports, because Mouse Sports had to use NATO Safix instead of Woxic, a significant downgrade as an AWPer there. And Woxic at the time was arguably their best player. I would have said Rops's, but a lot of people would say Woxic's the game changer, right? He's the guy who has to come on form for them to be able to perform. They had to use also Raging, their coach, who hasn't been a pro player in CSGO, except maybe at the very beginning of the game, instead of Carrigan after map 1 of the final. And Mouse Spots this is, and G2 still loses the final. It's actually super embarrassing that they didn't win that event in light of all that context. Even if Raging hadn't stepped in, they should have been winning that event. Then after that, they end the year by going to the Champions Cup final. In this tournament, they beat the failed Ents lineup that was absolute garbage back then, just giving out free wins everywhere. And then they beat Spirit, who, listen, now look good because they've done some things online in the CIS region, but were nowhere near a tier 1 team at the time. All Spirit ever has is fragging back then, at least. So you look at this time period, they were 12 best of 3 series won and 11 lost. Doesn't sound that terrible, right? Most of those wins were versus the Bombs. They were farming shitters at CS Summit, Champions Cup, etc. So actually, they were losing most of the series they played. They weren't looking anything like a top team. But along comes 2020, and Blast Spring comes. This new format, group stage system, best of 3s all the time. It's online, in the studio. They win their group. And they were in a group, remember, with 100 Thieves, who had been like top 5 ranked team months prior. They had Evil Geniuses at one point in time, I think were number 1 in the rankings very briefly towards the end of last year, but yes, had dropped off. And you had OG, who had like an interesting lineup, and some people might even have favoured their lineup to end up being better than the G2 lineup. It was kind of a neck and neck photo finish for the two teams at the time. So they weren't even favoured to get out of this group, and they won it. Then they go to IEM Katowice, one of the big events of the year. Now it's going to be one of the most important events of the year because we've hardly had any fucking lands. They come second. They have a monster run where even though, yes, they got swept in the final, who gives a fuck? Like, yes, they didn't win, but the rest of the tournament was straight fire. And also, as we'll talk about in this video, finals issues were to become a concern even when they were really good. So then, unfortunately, we have this scenario where all of competition has to go online. Now, when everything goes online, we have ESL Pro League Season 11. They come 10th to 12th. Yeah, that's pretty poor. Not really acceptable. That was basically one of their only slip-ups of the year. ESL Road to Rio, they came second. They made the final again. Gamers Without Borders tournament. It's a charity tournament. It doesn't really matter that you came 56 now. That's not counted against your record. Then we had the most recent DreamHack Spring Europe. They made the final. They came second. So there's no other team making this many finals. So you look at this lineup, you look at the strengths of it and how it's worked out. First of all, the firepower is a strength. Now, they're not a nuts like Team Liquid, Evil Geniuses at their peak type lineup, but the firepower in the big 3 is pretty legit relative to their roles. Kenny S is the best AWPer in the world and is back to being a top 5 player in the world for this year. He's been fantastic. He's really brought his career back to a level I haven't seen since 2015, 2014, if we're not saying the peak era. Then you consider, if he's your superstar, and then you have Hunter, a strong fragger who's coming into his own and getting better every 6 months, who's obviously not quite like Nico, his cousin, but he's still a skilled player and in the vein of Nico. If he's going to be your second star, you're already cooking with gas. Now we need a third who can be somewhat reliable and can contribute in other ways as well, possibly, and make us not just one-dimensional fragging team. Then they have Nexa, one of the best fragging in-game leaders in the game, who can just go off himself if one of those other two doesn't, and you have a chance to win any map. Then you look at the other two pieces. Jax is a surprisingly good CT side player at times, and especially on certain maps. This is a guy where I used to watch him in the old G2 and think, yeah, he do a good job as an entry, but like doesn't have the greatest skills. Eye test doesn't really work out that well. This guy, he just gets it done somehow. He uses his brain. He's one of the older players who came into the scene even as a top tier pro at an older age. Finally, you have Amanek. Now, I'll admit, I think sometimes Amanek is the odd man out and doesn't quite provide enough fragging, but you consider some of the things he's done in the past in G2. He was a secondary caller, he was a lurker, so I'm assuming they're just thinking put him in one of these roles. He also seems like a guy who doesn't cause a lot of friction in terms of personality and is fairly quiet. Also, let's add in the last G2 lineup, if you go back far enough in 2019, he was pretty good. He actually looked like the best player at times in that team, which says a lot considering they had Kenny S and Shocks in the lineup, admittedly in busted up form. You look at the map pool. What's interesting is they have some really strong maps. And the key for me is this, is that you look at the maps they're strong on, it's so hard for teams to get away from them in a best of three. Like, yeah, you can try and pick into one of their weaknesses, but odds are they play your map and whatever the middle map is. Because even though the map records, which I'll run through in a second, as you know, I don't just go on map win record. I look with the eye test and I judge who you've won and lost against, and I tell you what your best map is. I actually think the best map for this team, you could make a case, is it's between Mirage and Nuke for me, actually. Like, I look at the Mirage, which they've had 7 wins out of 12 games in the, I think I did this since the beginning of last month or something. Oh no, maybe it was last 3 months. Something like that. They've gone 7-5. Now, listen, they have lost their last 3. That's a problem. But some of those teams are pretty good on Mirage, to be fair. And a couple of those were overtime losses. So there's no problem there. And you have beaten teams like FaZe, Na'Vi. These teams definitely can fucking play Mirage. Then I actually think it was a toss-up between Mirage and Nuke as the second map. Same map record on Nuke. But you know what? They've won 7 of their last 9. They've beaten the likes of Vitality, who's actually been pretty decent on Nuke. FaZe isn't that big a deal. You lost to Astralis, but you also beat a different Astralis. Admittedly, it was not necessarily the big lineup. That's still pretty good. Now listen, Dust 2's been a map they've played a lot, and a lot of people have pointed out that yes, they've lost it tons and tons of times. They lost 4 of their last 6 on it, for example. Even in spite of that, out of their last 18 games on Dust 2, they won 7. And that's with like basically a little bad streak now where they're losing tons. But you look who they're losing to. You're losing to teams like FaZe Clan, Mouse Sports, FaZe Clan again, Big twice. Like, these are teams that play Dust 2. These are teams that are competent on Dust 2. You're not just losing the bombs, and then you are beating also teams that have skills on this map. So after that, I personally think Vertigo probably should be considered as the 7-4, and that's technically it's actually their best win rate. But the problem with that one is, listen, you haven't beaten that many top teams on it. You beat Mouse Sports on it, who were pretty good. You lost to a couple of times to Astralis and Vitality, but you know what? They're teams that actually have somewhat flexed into this map and have shown competency on it. What's interesting about Vertigo for me is initially they looked like one of the best teams on that map, actually. They even had a streak of like 6 wins in a row, or I think maybe even like 8 out of 9 wins or something. Problem is, listen, it's clearly not their worst map, especially not in the win rate. But it's also not their best map either, is it? Like, let's be real. The problem with that is, like, I wouldn't trust them to pick it every time. I think they have to situationally pick it. Then you look at the last 3 maps. Now we're getting into the more dodgy territory. By the way, aside from Dust 2, they only have 1 win map where they have a negative win rate, which is Train. And even then, they've beaten FaZe, who plays the map. They've beaten Ents, who plays the map. They've lost twice to Mouse Sports and once to FaZe in that time period. Mouse Spots, that was arguably their best map at times. So I actually think Train, you could maybe even argue, should be above Vertigo in this scenario. They have some strength. It's just they don't choose to play it themselves, which suggests to me they're not as comfortable on it, and that they don't go into it against teams who don't play it. Then you have Inferno, which they're 3-3 on. But the problem is, if you look at the 3 losses, they lost to Copenhagen Flames, FaZe and Vitality. Now listen, Vitality and maybe FaZe, I can sort of give you, I'm not that big a fan of FaZe on Inferno, but Copenhagen Flames, are you for real? So I personally think, even though you haven't got a negative win rate there, that's not because a map for them, it hasn't really suited them. And then Overpass, they're 1-1 on, but their win is over contact and the loss is to Astralis. So I don't really think that's relevant. I just ignore that map completely. It's obviously their least played map. They only played it twice in the last few months. Now, yes, choking in finals has been a big deal. You can even stem it back, quite frankly, before they got good to the Summit final, when they managed to lose that shit. They lost to Mouse Sports, but a bomby Mouse Sports. They lost to Na'Vi, admittedly a monster Na'Vi. They lost to Astralis, okay, Not the end of the world, pretty good team. And then they lost to Big. Now, losing to Big's not that great, even though Big's been in inspired form recently. I think some of that's online. I don't know if some of those players will transition as well offline. But hey, Big's a tactical team. If you play the Big style and you play it to a T, it should actually destroy teams that are more loose, like FaZe, like G2. So it makes logical sense in that regard. But that's the problem. If you look at who they're losing to, they're kind of all over the place here. So I do think it's a psychological issue. I also think it's potentially an issue with the pick ban. I mean, people know that they've picked into Dust 2 in some of the series. Not necessarily, I mean, they did it sometimes in the final, but in scenarios which has cost them. Now, that's because it used to be a good map for them. I get that, but it's such a dangerous pick, isn't it? As I always point out on broadcasts. So the future for this team is obviously we have to see them go offline. We can't just count them as the best just because they got the number 1 ranking. And hopefully that means when we have the major, I think the pieces are there to potentially win the major. I wouldn't pick them to, but they are a solid dark horse to do it. They should be an elite squad by the time they get there based on what I've seen this year. The map pool isn't as bad as it seems. Even Dust 2, in the context that, like, I don't think they just keep losing forever. I think they figure it out eventually with the fragging they've got in this team. I think they come back on Dust 2 and probably at least make it a map that they can be strong on again. Kenny S being a superstar is very positive if you want to win the major. Hunter is very good, but admittedly hasn't played many majors. And you've got a fragging IGL. These are great pieces, especially right now with so many other teams just falling apart. You've got Astralis falling apart, Na'Vi falling apart, Fnatic falling apart, Mouse falling apart. These are all the top ranked teams like 2 months ago. So now is the prime time to strike. If the major comes anytime soon, this team has got a real nice shot at going ahead and winning it and getting Kenny S that second major. They're the number 1 team in the world. Sure, it's online. But we haven't got any LAN players, so all we can judge them off is online. And quite frankly, they were banging on LAN before we got to online. Sure, they didn't win anything big, but they've overall been the most consistent team. That counts for something in an online era where everyone else is fucking up and down depending on what tournament it is. Still a big accomplishment, by the way. In the context of what's possible, it's the best you can do right now beyond winning the events. So for everyone who isn't Kenny S, it's a big deal to be ranked number 1 in Counter-Strike anytime in CSGO. Especially, by the way, for the owner, Ocelot, Carlos. Because think of where G2 were in 2018 and 2019. They were a laughing stock. Everyone said they'd never be as good as Vitality. They'll never overtake Vitality. They hit fucking number 1 in the rankings before Vitality did. Vitality only ever got to number 2. Then you consider, like, 2 or 3 years ago, everyone also used to mock him because obviously he kept sticking with Sharks and Kenny S and they brought in Existence. And I even myself made fun of the fact that, like, I think Ocelot's wife is French and she says she loves CSGO. So it's like, dude, the one division in your org that isn't good is the fucking one that your wife in theory wants. Like, happy wife, happy life. You're not killing it in that regard. So this is amazing that he's gotten his CSGO team to number 1 when he's had his League of Legends team number 1. I think his Rainbow Six team's number 1. This guy's fucking killing the game. Now, with that said, do it for real offline. Then we can really talk history. This video was kindly supported by Alexander Rao, Bobby, Dean Tanglis, Istar, JDubs, Jensen Goh, the Puyallup Tribe, Soliko, Spencer Green, Tobias Bernasconi, Xinged, and a special thanks, as always, goes out to my main man, Jerky's Minion. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Maybe you want to ask me a question in those AMAs I do each month. Do you want teasers for who's going to appear next on my content? Maybe you want to take part in one of those lengthy discussions about esports with me. Well, if so, then put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link in the description box below.